This video is intended to address a couple of questions raised by some of the groups regarding the United States Catholic Catechism for Adults. One of the questions was on baptism, and the group raised a question based on the canon law of the Church. Church canon law says that we cannot baptize a child unless we have a reasonable reason to believe that the child will be raised in the Catholic faith. So in other words, if there's no reasonable belief that the child will actually be raised Catholic, we don't baptize the child. Now, this group said, given the seriousness of baptism, would you recommend then that if you didn't find there to be a reasonable belief that the child would be raised in the Catholic faith, that the child should be baptized somewhere else? Let's think about this way. In a baptism of an infant, the godparents are standing up for the child, saying that we are going to be the ones responsible for raising them in the Christian faith. I would say that if you can find godparents who are willing to do that, and they actually mean what they say, they're not just saying it for ceremonial reasons, but they actually take that seriously, by all means, baptize them in another Christian denomination. But if it's just going to be a ceremonial thing, where the godparents are going to say that, but then the child is going to be brought up in a very secular environment, never hearing about Christ, never hearing about scriptures or something, then I'd say that the godparents are making a serious promise in front of God that they know they're going to break. So I would say, no, they shouldn't do that. So my suggestion would be, is if there's a chance that this child is going to be raised in a Christian faith, by all means, baptize the child. But if there's no reason to believe that, what's going to happen is, first of all, you're not saving the child by baptizing them. God can save a child who hasn't been baptized if it was through no fault of their own. Okay, God's not bound by the sacraments, in other words. But the godparents would be bringing judgment upon themselves for claiming that they were going to raise the child or help to raise the child in a Christian faith when in fact they have no intention of doing that. And that's making a mockery not only of the sacrament of baptism, but it's also very much blaspheming before God, making a promise before God that is not going to be held, that's not going to be maintained or upheld. So I would say you've got to be careful, and I'd say it depends on the nuances of the situation. But certainly if the godparents were saying, well, I can't raise them Catholic, but I would certainly raise them, Lutheran or just generic Christian or, evangelical or any other Christian denomination, by all means, baptize the child. The second question that came up was one about grace, and it was asking what's the difference between habitual grace, sanctifying grace, and actual grace. So the first thing is, sanctifying grace, also known as habitual grace, so these are the two things, just different terms for the two for one type of grace, is grace that we experience really in the afterlife in heaven. It's a permanent grace. It does not depart from us. So it's the grace that we have to be sanctified, to be brought into relationship with God, and it's a permanent grace. Then we have actual grace. Actual grace is grace that occurs in an actual moment, in an actual situation. So for example, we might say that we pray for the grace that if we're ever persecuted, to be able to stand up and proclaim our faith in the face of that persecution. That grace becomes actualized in the moment when we are actually persecuted. And we are given that grace, hopefully, at the moment of persecution so that we can, in fact, stand up for our faith. Similarly, actual graces occur at many different moments in our lives. We might have the actual grace to witness to Christ. We might have the actual grace to feed the hungry, to live out the Beatitudes in a particular situation. But then 3 days later, we might do something very sinful or pass by the beggar on the street or not stand up for our faith. That's why it's called actual grace. It's actualized in a moment, and in another moment, we may not be given the actual grace, and so we fail to live up to that expectation of Christ. All grace, of course, is a gift from God, so none of it is anything that we earn by our own merit. But grace can build upon itself. The more we open ourselves to grace, the more receptive we become to grace, and the more it works in our lives, which can then open us up further to other graces and to additional graces, and can build us up. So in many sense, we need to be open to grace. And as we open ourselves to these actual graces, they can start to become a type of habitual grace. They don't fully become habitual grace until we've actually made them permanent, where they can't be removed or taken away from us, which really that's only in heaven, because that's the only place where we can say we will now never sin again, is when we're in that beatific vision in heaven. But until then, what we experience here on earth are types of actual graces that are lived out in our daily lives, in the actual moments of our daily lives. So I hope that explains the difference between habitual or sanctifying grace and actual grace. And then, of course, there's everybody's favorite, which is grace before meals.